Hey guys, welcome back to my Animal Adventures YouTube channel. And if you've been watching my videos, you know I keep and breed a lot of snakes. And I actually have these really high-end racking systems made by ARS. It's really expensive. And in this video, I want to show you a cheap, easy, and fast way to set up a racking system to house your collection of snakes. Okay, so first I want to show you what a really high-end snake rack looks like. This is actually an ARS 5040. It's a 50 series tub, and in a full rack there's actually 40 racks, rows of 4, 10 rows of 4 is a complete rack. And actually the tubs just slide right out. And in the very back over here, there's actually a heat panel that I'd say it's probably 6 inches wide, and it's controlled by a thermostat. The hot spot I actually have about 90 degrees. And then when the tubs slide out, this is what the tubs look like. They actually have a little drink holder with a Dixie cup. I like these little cups because you don't really have to clean anything. You just pop them right out and you can throw the cup away. And what I actually do is I actually reuse the cup. I never throw it away. So I was actually going through a lot of cups when I first started, and then I realized I could just put them in a big garbage bag, and then I wash them by hand. And when I have some extra time, I actually go through and I'd wash the cups that I need. And this guy, he's been doing really good. This is my pastel scaleless head ball python. She is doing really good. This is a female. She is a really stunning snake, and she's doing fantastic in here. And what I actually use for a substrate is this coconut husk bedding. And you can use, there's different one. There's actually one put out by a Freedom breeder. There's Reptichip or Pro Coco, a bunch of different brand names. And what I like to do is I like to keep it damp on the bottom and kind of dry on top. And ball pythons, they really like, I would say, not too damp of an environment. If you keep them too damp, they'll actually get respiratory infections. And I've seen a lot of people, that's like the #1 problem with a lot of snake keepers is they'll actually keep their ball pythons a little bit too damp, and it'll actually give them the respiratory infections. And you definitely want to avoid keeping too much humidity in your tubs. So believe it or not, I didn't always have an entire snake room filled with these high-end racks. It took me a long time to really invest and build up my whole racking system. And let me tell you, for a full rack for 5040 with shipping included to your door, they truck ship it out. It's about $300 to ship the rack, and a full rack delivered is about $3,000. So you're talking about a huge investment, let me tell you. And actually, when I first started, I was going to breed my very first year, and someone offered to sell me a collection of snakes, and I already had the money, and I was going to buy a rack system. And the snakes came up, and it was a whole bunch of females, and I thought, oh, I could really boost my production of hatchlings if I had these females. So what I did is I actually bought the female ball pythons that were ready to breed. The guy raised them up. They were like 3 to 5 years old, and it was pretty much a no-brainer because it really boosted my production my very first year, and I had a lot of hatchlings. But I didn't really have any place to put those female ball pythons. And so what I did is I bought the female ball pythons, and then I actually ordered my rack, and the guy said, oh, you know, I can't hold on to these ball pythons. I need to unload them. He had something in his life, and he had to get rid of all his ball pythons. So what I actually did is I set up a temporary setup. And let me show you actually what I did here for my temporary setup. I actually just used these totes, and these totes are really inexpensive. You can get them at Home Depot, and I can't quite remember what size they are, but basically what I did is I just put coconut husk in. This is really dry coconut husk, and what I actually use is a little watering can for all my snakes to water the substrate. And basically that's all the moisture I put in there, and that's pretty much good to go. You want enough moisture to keep it damp, but you don't want it soaking where it's actually sitting in the water. And then what I did is, this is actually one of the snakes I picked up on my package deal. It's a pastel female. She laid eggs last year, and actually she was pretty, I'd say pretty comfortable in there as far as being in there short term. And what I did is I just had these lids. You definitely want a lid that snaps on and locks. And that was it. That's basically the enclosure for that ball python. So here is kind of the setup that I had before. I actually bought some wire shelving like this when I was temporarily housing those ball pythons. And this is actually a little bit shorter. The one I had was actually 48 inches across. And this is actually a 2-foot container. So I could put 2 side by side and 2 on top of each other. So it was like 4 snakes per shelf. And just one shelf, I could actually fit 20 ball pythons in that setup. And this is basically what they're like. It's almost just like a tub, like in a rack system. The only thing I didn't have in there was water. And really, it was really short term. I would say you could probably keep an adult ball python for probably, I would say, at least 2 to 3 weeks without water, and I wouldn't go probably much further than 2 weeks. Typically, I would say a lot of my females hardly drink any water. You would definitely want to make sure they have water over the long term, but I'd say a full-size ball python, it could go at least 2 weeks without water. But you definitely don't want to have a hatchling go for very long without water. They will dry out really fast. So for a more long-term solution, I would definitely go with a deeper tub, something that has a little more height for the snake to move around. And I would definitely go with a locking lid. I really like these lids that have these little snapping locks on them that actually hold the lid on. So if the snake tries to push on the top, he can't actually escape. And the one thing you definitely want long-term is you definitely want a heat pad on one side, and you actually put the pad underneath. And what I like to use is these jump start heaters. This is actually what I started with. And essentially what you do is you plug your heat pad into here, and then it's controlled by the jump start. This is basically the thermostat that controls the heat pad underneath. And you can use almost any kind of a heat pad. They sell the little Zoom Ed pads, or they even actually have the strips. You can go to reptilebasics.com and have them cut to any size and have the cords put on, and you can have them run. What I actually would like to do is, if I went with a setup like this, I would actually have a really long heat strip that's going all across, the wire shelf or whatever, and actually have it attached to the actually shelving, and then it's not attached to the tub to where you can actually slide it's kind of like a rack system where it would actually be the heat strip on some kind of a surface, and then maybe some kind of a protector over that so you don't tear it up, and then just slide the tub right on the heat mat. And that would actually be the ideal situation, and then control it with a jump start heater. And then the other thing you want is some kind of a hide for the snake. And if you look at this hide, I actually bought some snakes, some ball pythons with this kind of a hide, and let me tell you, this does not count as a hide for a ball python. It has to be totally enclosed. If you try to put a ball python in here, it will feel exposed, and it'll never. I've seen these in a lot of tanks, and they're really never comfortable, and they never really hang out in them. And what you really want is you want a little hide, something like this that's totally enclosed with just one little hole on the front. And that's what I'd recommend, something like that. And then I would recommend a really big water dish, if you can find one, that the snake can actually soak. And let me pull one of my hatchlings, and I'll show you this. I'll pull one of my coral glows here. So you can see this boy here, he's probably, I would say he's probably almost too big for this. Well, yeah, he's probably too big for a hide like this. So what you'd really want to do for a snake, my hatchlings are growing really fast. What I would actually recommend is going with a bigger hide like this, something really big to completely cover the snake just like that. And it has a little hole right there, and let me tell you, that snake is completely comfortable in a hide like that. So the other option is if you actually have king snakes. I actually went with a different type of a hide. Take a look at this. This is actually more of a king snake hide, and it actually it's all totally enclosed, and the snake actually crawls inside here and actually hides out in the middle. And this works fantastic for smaller king snakes. Usually the real big king snakes can't fit in an enclosure like this. And then another thing you can do with this is if you had something a little bit bigger, you could put a hide and a water bowl and then have this with like moist sphagnum moss, and the snake could go in here when he's getting ready to shed. And I've heard a lot of people put like the moisture boxes in here with the sphagnum moss, and they never really have problems with the snake shedding. So here's the funny thing about ball pythons. If you actually keep a snake in an enclosure like this, essentially what you're doing is this right here is what the ball python thinks is this entire enclosure, the size of the enclosure. And really if you move over to one of these tubs actually imitate an entire enclosure. So for example, if you went from something like this to like this, you know, essentially in a gray tub like this, you wouldn't really put a hide because the whole hide acts as the enclosure. And I've actually seen clear tubs, and the problem with clear tubs in a rack system like this is if you have a clear tub, then the snake feels exposed, especially if it's a really crystal clear tub and they can actually see outside of it. As a matter of fact, when I put my ball python in that tote on the wire shelf, he could kind of see through it, and he was kind of freaking out because he didn't really feel secure. And if you actually move a ball python from an enclosure like this to over in a rack system like this, it really increases his virtual living space, because really they live in the dark in the enclosure. So there are really two types of really inexpensive enclosures for your ball python. One is the tote type, the plastic tote, and the other one is the glass aquarium. And I would actually recommend doing a tote over an aquarium. Aquariums, the problem with aquariums is really to give it ventilation, you need ventilation from the top. Whereas in a tote, you can actually have a solid top, and you definitely want to drill holes in the side. You definitely want to put air holes. And typically people put air holes all the way around. Some will put like, you know, a little wire mesh circle on the front and the back. And I've seen some really fancy rack systems with just totes is all they're using for their ball pythons, and they put round mesh on the front and the back, and they just kind of slide them in and out of like wooden shelving or wire shelving, and it works really well. And the other thing you really have to think of is if you're kind of storing your ball pythons in totes just temporarily like I did, you definitely want the right temperature in your room. So in this room, I was really confident that my ball pythons would be okay, because I keep my room in the low to mid 80s. And I definitely wouldn't put a ball python in an enclosure without some kind of a heat source if I'd say it's probably less than mid 70s. You definitely want to control the room temperature if you don't have a heat source. So the other thing I should mention is if you're actually storing your ball pythons on a wire rack in a tub with a substrate with no water and no heat source, you definitely want to keep them off of food. So typically when you feed a ball python, it definitely needs the heat source to digest. So in my case, it was just really temporary, just a couple weeks, and while I was waiting for my rack to come in. As a matter of fact, it was kind of an emergency setup. I would definitely not recommend something like that for the long term. For the long term, you could do it with taller tubs, and you definitely would want at least a heat mat and some water in there, and preferably some kind of a hide. So another thing, when you're constructing your rack systems, or you're thinking about going with a more inexpensive rack, especially if you're thinking about doing the totes, you have to think about the long-term kind of outlook of what you're going to do as far as keeping and breeding some of these reptiles. So for example, I would highly recommend actually, instead of doing the totes, going with a more of a high-end system. You can actually buy these rack systems one level at a time, and that is a pretty inexpensive way to go. As a matter of fact, they actually sell 70 series tubs, the 7030, like I had my big ball python in, for I think it's It's like $100 a level just for one tub. It comes with the tub and the rack and the heat panel and everything, and I'd say it's really a better system, and it holds its value more long term. And the other thing you have to think about is a lot of breeders that I've seen, they'll go with really cheap totes. They'll fill their whole room with totes, and then then they'll start selling hatchlings. They'll get some money, and they're like, oh, I have to upgrade my whole room. And then basically what they'll do is they'll kind of scrap everything that they've done and start over again. And I would actually recommend building a little bit more high-end, building slower to where you get to kind of where I am. This took me probably 5 years to get a whole room of really professional rack system, but let me tell you, I will never have to replace this as long as I keep reptiles. Okay, so that wraps up my discussion of how to construct a cheap, fast, and easy ball python racking system. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.